I'm going to have to probably duck out for a couple of seconds. I've got a delivery coming, but it won't take long. I have to run out and back. Okay.
Out. I think.
I'm advocating for dark clothes.
Something like that.
You know that song?
I think we've got everything going. Let's get we'll get Craig Butt in here and we can.
Now recording.
I turned it up because you were very quiet. Awesome. I had us at page 22, basically the second of the ways that Spinoza was it. I had us at the second paragraph, or am I far back?
No, I think we'd finished. Yeah, we're on to page 25, onto the third.
25, the third. Sorry. Yes, the third.
Yeah.
I went back rereading. I find myself rereading. All right. I guess we'll kick it off. Thanks for joining us as we go through Spinoza, Practical Philosophy, monograph by Gilles Deleuze. We're making our way through the early parts of the book as Deleuze is sort of outlining what he sees as, does he say how many there are? And I know how many there are. Give a reason for his, it's the three, right? The three resemblances to Nietzsche. And in Spinoza's lifetime, they're the reason for him being accused of being a materialist, a moralist, and we've gone through the materialist, gone through the immoralist, and we're about to dive into the atheist. These three things we'll just say, cause issues for Spinoza, his era. So we'll move into the third, a devaluation of the sad passions. Choice. Anyone have a? I'm gonna just give me a. I adore the library. Couple of really, really awful in the world. Oh, this is so much better. Thank you, Jean. Oh my God. Look at how organized this. Okay, I'll share the screen and you can get. All right, I want to make sure that we're getting video. All right. Three, a devaluation of all the sad passions in favor of Spinoza, the atheist. If ethics and morality merely interpreted the same precept in a different way, the distinction between them would only be theoretical. This is not the case. Throughout his work, Spinoza does not cease to denounce three kinds of personages: the man with sad passions, the man who exploits these sad passions, needs them in order to establish his power, and the man who is saddened by the human condition and by human passions in general. He may make fun of these as much as he disdains them, but this mockery is a bad laughter. The slave, the tyrant, and the priest, the moralist trinity. Since Epicurus and Lucretius, the deep implicit connection between tyrants and slaves has never been more clearly shown. Quote, in despotic statecraft, supreme and essential mysteries to hoodwink the subject, to mask the fear which keeps them down, with the specious garb of religion, so that men may fight as bravely for slavery as for safety, and count it not shame but highest honor to risk their blood and lives for the vainglory of the tyrant. This is possible because the sad passion is a complex that joins desire's boundlessness, the mind's confusion, cupidity to superstition. Quote, those who most ardently embrace every sort of superstition cannot help but be those who most moderately desire external advantages. The tyrant needs sad spirits in order to succeed, just as sad spirits need a tyrant in order to be content and to multiply. In any case, what unites them is their hatred of life, their resentment against life. The ethics draws a portrait of the resentful man, for whom all happiness is an offense, but who makes wretchedness or impetus his only passion. Quote, but those who know how to break men's minds rather than strengthen them are burdensome both to themselves and to others. That is why many, from too great an impatience of mind, a false zeal for religion, have preferred to live among the lower animals, like boys or young men who cannot bear calmly the scolding of their parents and take refuge in the army. They choose the inconveniences of war and the discipline of an absolute commander, in preference to the conveniences of home and the admonitions of the father. Take vengeance on their parents, allow all sorts of burdens. Where do we want to start, everyone? Obviously, we can go back through and be. I mean, it's you and me, Derek. It's going to be you and me, Derek.
Well, I think we'll just go through it, I suppose. This seems quite a clear paragraph.
Mm-hmm.
So once again, it's a kind of difference between ethics and morality. So if we remember, morality is the kind of judgment. It's the kind of it's your duty, what you must do according to a kind of transcendent law, which is usually the law of God or religion. So he says if ethics and he said ethics, morality merely interpret the same precepts in a different way. The distinction between them would only be theoretical. Therefore, so the precepts are kind of the rules of behaviour, let's say. So if it was only about if they had the same rules of behaviour, then they would the only difference between them would be one of theory, but one would be theoretical. But he said this is not the case. And he says throughout his work, Spinoza does not cease to denounce three kinds of personages. The man with sad passions, the man who exploits those passions, who needs them in order to establish his power, and the man who is saddened by the human condition and by human passions in general. And this is this last one is the notion of satire. He may make fun of these as much as he disdains and mockeries of bad laughter. And then these three kind of these three kinds of personages are kind of personified as the slave, the tyrant, and the priest, which Deleuze calls the moralist trinity. And then he goes on to say, since Epicurus and Lucretius, the deep implicit connection between tyrants and slaves never been more clearly shown. And again, is that quote from Spinoza. So it shows the relationship between the tyrant and the slave. He says that in despotic statecraft, the supreme and essential mystery is to hoodwink the subjects, to mask the fear that keeps them down with specious garb of religion, so that men may fight as bravely for slavery as for safety, and count it not shame but highest honour to risk their blood and lives for the vainglory of a tyrant. So, I think one of the ideas here is that, as we've seen already, he said we're sad. We have this. We don't understand. We have no understanding of. The way in which Deleuze framed it was in terms of cause and effect. We only see effect. We don't understand causes. And so we have no understanding of what causes things. So we're essentially we're sad. This is the thing we said earlier. I think it might have been the first one of these practical theses. And so he says. So he said, what the tyrant aims to do is to hoodwink the subjects and to mask the fear that keeps them down, so they don't know why they're fearful, and they want to hide that with religion, so that they, as he said, they fight so as bravely for slavery as for safety and count it not a shame, etc. And he said this is possible because the sad passion is a complex that joins desires, boundlessness to their mind's confusion, cupidity to superstition. So we have these two. We have passion, sad passion, I should say, and that joins with desire. So the endless desire with confusion. Mind's confusion is, like I say, it's this. We only understand effects. We don't understand causes, and this is how Deleuze frames it. And so cupidity is joined to superstition. This is what keeps the kind of the slaves down. And then another quote: "Those who most ardently embrace every sort of superstition can help but be those who most immoderately desire external advantage." So this is the tyrant. So the tyrant needs sad spirits in order to succeed, just as sad spirits need a tyrant in order to be content. So it's through the tyrant that their confusion, their unhappiness becomes masked, probably by the idea of religion, or to be content.
I'm hesitant.
In any case, but
I'm hesitant to say that's specifically the tyrant because it's the way that he's sort of phrasing. Getting echo. The way that he's sort of phrasing this is it's not necessarily that the tyrant's alone and he wants something different, acts different. Like there's some semblances there, like the line, "Those who most ardently embrace every cannot help but be those who most immoderately desire external advantages." He's referring just in general to the story of like the resentful man, that the people who, and that it's the slaves too. It's everyone has this sort of external desire, these advantages, not necessarily only the tyrant.
Yeah, I mean, I read that as the tyrant, the one who desires external advantage. So they're always looking for, to advance themselves for material gain. And one of the ways they do that is by advancing their own position in society, and they do that by keeping everyone down. The other people will support them, the so-called slaves. That's just how I read it.
But isn't a tyrant also a slave to his own passions? Instead of using his power to overcome his sad passions, he's using his power to dominate and to enslave others. So he's also a slave to his own passions. He's misusing his power.
Yeah, it's just like the next sentence. The tyrant needs sad spirits to succeed, just as sad spirits need the tyrant in order to be. The push here is that all of it is sad passions that he's talking about here, which kind of comes in many forms, but he's putting them all together. There's some specificity he's got, but it's not, to me, it's not just the tyrant who has this set up.
Yeah, because
I mean, I think the way.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, sorry. Yeah, the way in which they're joined together is that they're resentful. I think that seems to be the kind of the common thread, for whom all, perhaps, anyway, I don't know, for whom all happiness is an offence, and who makes wretchedness or impotence is only passion. So these passions are wretchedness and impotence. And I think, just go back to what J.K. was saying, I think is reflected in this next quote. But those who know how to break men's minds, i.e. the tyrant, rather than strengthen them, are burdensome both to themselves and to others. So they're burdensome to others, but also to themselves. That is why many from too great and impatient mind, falsely of ridicule, prefer to live among the lower animals rather than among men. They're like boys, they're scolding their parents, terrific in the army. They choose inconvenience of war and the discipline of an absolute commander. I mean, that obviously, and that's we want, can be God, in preference to the convenience of home and the admissions of a father. And while they take vengeance on their parents, they allow all sorts of burdens to be placed on them. I think on them, I would say themselves, I think that means. I don't think it means burdens to be placed on their parents, but to be placed on themselves. So I think that is it's a kind of complex image, but I think it's kind of drawing together this kind of interrelation between the tyrant and the slave.
Yeah, would you say that the tyrant is also a man of resentment? That's where his sad passions, come from.
Yeah, I think that's the point. He said,
Mm-hmm.
so they're resentful. They trade on sad, what Spinoza or Deleuze calls sad passions.
Yeah, I guess while we're stopped, I think with the definitions, the trick is to take them through like what it is that's being done, rather than like looking for the tyrant in terms of like an already established social place, right? So I don't think the tyrant is necessarily like a king in the traditional sense, right? Somebody wears a crown. It's somebody who uses the sad power, the sad passions to extend their power, right?
Yes.
So, it could be that's what makes you a tyrant. So it could be somebody, um, say of the lower class, if we're thinking kind of feudalistically, but they use the passions to develop their power, right, to extend themselves, perpetuate themselves, right? So the sad passions become like compensatory and extensive in that way, as opposed to just having them.
Yeah. The Politicus, his big treatise on, he opens up by talking about philosophers. One of these, just to read a little bit of that, because it's the beginning of treatise, the Politicus Theologica. Philosophers conceive of the passions, harass us, vices, which men fall by their own fault, and therefore generally deride, bewail, or blame them, if they wish to seem unusually pious. And so they think they are doing something wonderful, in the pinnacle of learning, when they are clever enough to bestow manifold praise on such human nature as is nowhere to be found, and to make verbal attacks on that which in fact exists. For they conceive of men not as they are, they themselves would like them to be. Whence it has come to pass that instead of ethics, they have generally written satire. They have generally written satire, and that they have never conceived a theory of politics that could be turned to use, but such as might be taken for a chimera, or might be formed in utopia, or in that golden age of poets when, to be sure, there was. Accordingly, as in all sciences of useful applications, especially in that of politics, theory is supposed to be at variance with practice, seemed less to fit direct public affairs than theorists or. He's very much taking sort of this stand against the culture, the resent, we'll come to call it resentment, but it's the resentful man. And he starts with philosophers, moves to statesmen, which moves to like people of the Commonwealth and politicians. And it's just the way that people sort of use these systems in order to gain that external advantage.
Yeah, so like in that sense, right, the three kinds of personages, right? There's people who just have sad passions. There's people who use those sad passions to be able to do things right to enhance their capacities. And then there's people who just like this is just kind of like wallowing in it, right? You know, the human condition is degrading, right? Passions in general, you know, so like general, I would call it just melancholy, right? But it gives you kind of three ways to think about how people use the passions or how the passions use people.
Well, and there's an edge there because what Spinoza's critiquing is the idea that, oh, look, you're just sort of, everything's fucked up. Look at how bad people are. Look at how much they can't help anything. Look at how much you can't help anything. Oh my, how. And so you've got like the first who are like the man who with sad passions is sort of internally built this way. Then you have the man who exploits those, the priest very often, or the tyrant. Then you have those who, like a philosopher, or theologian, or prophet, or who is saddened by how awful things are. Oh my, how sad that this is what people can't help to be. And this is what he's like, no, it's no, no. This is not the way things are. There's a lot of other shit going on, but it's people who basically spend their self, as you say, wallowing in. And that's the end here, where he's talking about people who sort of drop out of that. The portrait of the resentful man for whom all happiness is an offense and wretchedness. I mean, I could draw a line directly today, but it's people who basically have built careers and lives and stories and everything on this idea that people are wretched, people are broken, that things are unable to be fixed, that you have to be part of that, and that this is set up. But those who know how to break men's minds rather than strengthen them, burdensome both to themselves and others. Many drop out. It's why many simply, sort of move to the countryside, become farmers. Not necessarily, he's not speaking here about like amongst the wolves, but like farm people who just cut themselves out of the social order. Young men who can't really handle the sort of odd secondary sort of admonitions from a parent, and they prefer the tyrant because it's direct and specific. That feels better. The inconvenience of war, the discipline of an absolute command, convenience of home. By doing this, they take burdens, like Derek said, onto themselves. Putting themselves in this position, they're willing to accept more because, again, they're people who wallow in the sad passions, being manipulated by those utilized.
Well, or perhaps not manipulated there, but like, so this is the thing, right?
Manipulated is probably the
life
wrong word.
does,
Fair. Manipulated.
well, no, but it's worth exploring that, right? Because I mean, usually the critique of the priest is that he manipulates people, right? But like Spinoza and Deleuze are coming at this through life and happiness, right? That's at least when I see Epicurus, that's their ethics, right? Is it's a kind of like hedonism, but not in the way we usually use that word. But so that's the like as I read that, right? Like to your point, you know, my parents are keeping me down. I'll join the army, right? And that's that them becoming tyrants in a sense, right? Because somebody's keeping me down, right? So I've got the sad passions. And what am I going to do about it? I'm going to go somewhere else with those sad passions and expand my capacities through those passions, right? So, and this is what I mean about it's not like the tyrant at the top of the like the monarchy. It's like the tyrant in terms of what you do with your passions. Because the contrast is right because they hate life, as Spinoza and Deleuze are saying, right? They hate that things perpetuate themselves in that kind of productive way that's been described, right? That's kind of the foil that he's got set up there.
The them at the last word of the paragraph is that the parents or the young men? The young men, right?
It's the young men.
Burdens.
It's the young men. Certainly
Okay.
the young men. So he's talking there. The phrasing he uses in. I'm just going to read. I can read ethics. Specifically, the footnote here is in Ethics 4, appendix is the footnote 13. Just to read it, it's about this in general. But for this, there is no need of skill and watchfulness, for men are diverse, seeing that those who live under the guidance of you, yet are they generally envious and more prone to revenge than to sympathy? No small force of character is therefore required to take everyone as he is and to restrain oneself from imitating the others. But for those who carp at mankind and are more skilled in railing at vice than instilling virtue, and who break rather than strengthen men's dispositions, are hurtful both to themselves and others. Thus many, from too great impatience of spirits or from misguided religious zeal, have preferred to live among brutes rather than men, as boys or youths, who cannot peaceably endure the chidings of their parents, will enlist as soldiers and choose the hardships of war and the despotic discipline in preference to the comforts of home and the admonitions of their father, suffering any burdens to be put upon them so long as they may spite their parents. So there you go. Deleuze sums it up nicely. Is very. Last notes where I forward. All right.
None for me.
There is then a philosophy of life in Spinoza, consists precisely in denouncing all that separates us from life, all these transcendent values that are turned against life, these values that are tied to the conditions, illusions of consciousness. Life is poisoned by the categories of blame and merit, sin, redemption. What poisons life is hatred, including the hatred that is turned back against oneself in the form of guilt. Spinoza traces, step by step, the dreadful concatenation of sad passion. First, sadness itself, then hatred, aversion, despair, morsus conscientiae, pity, indignation, envy, humility, repentance, self-abasement, shame, regret, anger, vengeance. His analysis goes so far that even in hatred and security, he's able to find that grain of sadness suffices to make these feelings the feelings of slaves. The true city offers citizens the love of freedom instead of the hope of rewards or even the security of possessions. For, quote, it is slaves, not free men, who are given rewards for virtue. Spinoza is not among those who think that a passion has something good about it. Before Nietzsche denounces all the falsifications of life, all the values in the name of which disparage life. We do not live, we lead a semblance of. We think of how to keep from dying, whole life. Aside from the smallest song, picked up a chorus. I think it's a pretty clear passage. Also had the joke about the dark side. Either way, but it's life is poisoned by these transcendent categories. He wants to get back to this idea of what life is, how it actually is acting, what it's having, the idea of any of these things, and he names a bunch here, but ultimately Spinoza does in ethics sort of trace it back to this sort of sadness that there is, and this is why the term sad passions is what Deleuze is using here, that there's something sad in it. There's something it's not just that you have anger or fear or mockery or whatever it may be, that there's something sad in it, grain of sadness that allows these things to be that of slaves.
Yeah, well, I think that, so here, as he says, philosophy of life, and he wants, as he said, he wants to denounce all. Spinoza wants to denounce all that separates us from life, and all those transcendent values, which are basically values of good and evil, or sin and redemption, blame and merit. And he said, what poisons life is hatred. So hatred, which is resentment of others, but also guilt, which was hatred turned against oneself. And then Spinoza traces step by step the sad passion. So this is a kind of list of passions, that descend from sadness. So if you start from sadness, then hatred, then aversion, then mockery, fear, despair, morsus conscientia. I've just looked that up. It means my translation says the bites of conscience. So it's something like your conscience kind of being on at you, and pity, indignation, envy, humility, repentance. So they are in a line, they're in a link, they are linked together. Self-abasement, shame, regret, anger, vengeance, cruelty. And he says, his analysis goes far, even in hatred and security, he finds a grain of sadness to make these are the feelings of slaves. And then he talks about what the true city offers citizens the love of freedom instead of the hope of rewards or even security possessions. For, quote, his slaves, not free men, are given rewards of virtue. So there's no such thing as a sad passion. All these sad passions of sadness, hatred, aversion, going back, etc., mockery, which is a satirical idea again, fear, despair. He says, so it's not among those think that a sad passion is something good about it. And before Nietzsche, so Nietzsche obviously is a kind of later inheritor of Spinoza. He denounces all falsification of life, all the values in the name of which we disparage life. And we do not live, we only lead a semblance of life. We can only think of how to keep from dying, and our whole life is a death worship. So this is a life in which we're captured, the life of slaves, I would say, captured by the sad.
Yeah, he's also critiquing these transcendent values, including the idea of death, and because his is a philosophy of life, and he's saying that death is a kind of a value, an illusion of a value, because in his philosophy there is no death, there is just life itself. Instead of worshiping life, nature, that is continuous and infinite and never ending, people are under the illusion that they need to worship death or to be afraid of death and having to do things to avoid death. And so it's a death worship. It's a transcendent value, just like everything else that is, that is an illusion of some sorts that's, misuse of the kind of process of life.
Yes, it's a very positive sort of rejection of the idea that sad passions value to the almost the old phrase of like, well, character, awful things happen to it, like no, there's not something good about it. We need to like rethink that, and that's this line he has here is about the rewards. One of better parts for me, paragraph is, it is slaves, not free men, who are given rewards for virtue. To just read that part from Ethics. For a dominion that looks no farther than to lead men by fear will be rather free from vices than possessed of virtue. But men are so to be led, they may think they are not led, but living after their own mind and according to their free decision, so that they are restrained only by love of liberty, desire to increase their property, and hope of gaining the honor of dominion. But effigies, triumphs, and other incitements to virtue are signs of slavery rather than liberty, for rewards of virtue are granted to slaves, not free men. I admit indeed that men are very much stimulated by these instincts, but as in the first instance, they are awarded to great men, so afterwards, with the growth of envy, they are granted to cowards. Of that line, and men swollen with the extent of their wealth, the great indignation of all good men. Secondly, those who boast of their ancestors' effigies and triumphs think they are wronged, not preferred to others. Lastly, not objections, it is certain that quality, which once cast off the general liberty, is lost, can by no means pained from the time that peculiar honors are by public law decreed to any man renowned for. Boy, I wonder why he upset a lot of people during this era.
Yeah, it's interesting that he begins this paragraph with Nietzsche because I think he's resonating with Nietzsche's idea of the eternal recurrence of the same. That it is not death that is that is life, but that life that is eternally recurrent.
Well, and Nietzsche's entire push towards resentment and the play of the Uberman, one who's taken by sad, able to live. And there's a lot of ways to read it. I know there's a lot to be done. And again, Spinoza really did an extreme.
Yeah, I guess while we're there, I don't know if he's saying there's no death per se, but I think it's about how death's getting qualified here, right? Because this is kind of like life turning against itself, right? This is like life um, sort of killing itself in a sense, right? Because for me, what I think what's kind of interesting here is so like right, life is poisoned by the categories of good and evil, right? So good and evil, not just evil, right? Good and evil um, detract from the health of life, right? Of blame and merit. And that's saying a lot, right? So taking on blame, being blameworthy, which something Aristotle focuses on, as well as merit, right? So like excellence. Of sin and redemption. Need I say more on that one? And then he goes on to talk about hatred.
Just
Yeah,
real
how
quick
hatred
on the
turns
death
back.
thing, because I'll let you get to that, but the death thing I think is really important because it's definitely not that he's saying there is. The phrasing around our whole life is death is not that we adore death or that we worship it in that way, but Deleuze is saying it a little bit more wryly in style of what he says, Spinoza says throughout ethics, that we spend our time in fear of death. That fear of death causes everything we do to be done in service of death. In that way, our life becomes a death. And instead, we shouldn't fear death. Like that's basically, we shouldn't fear death, but we can't, but of course, the sad passions people manipulating lead us down this road, push these.
So instead of using the word death, you could put in the word change.
Oh no, death for sure. It's specifically death because he's shitting on afterlife. He's shitting on a lot of stuff here. There's a lot of things focused around. It's the fear of being punished after death, not knowing what comes after death. Yeah.
Right. So if you accept death, as part of life, then you would accept it as you would accept change. That it is a process, a philosophy of sorts.
Yeah. Sorry, Jack. Please go ahead.
Hey, you're good. I think we have to come back to death, right? Because we can only think of how to keep from dying in our whole life as death worship, right? So we stave off dying. On one hand, we stave off dying. On the other hand, we worship dying, right? So it's like this interesting idea where, what life does is it becomes putting off dying, right? Kind of forestalling that, and it becomes worshiping that outcome in a sense, right? Because I think to your point, bro, it's like on one hand it can be fear, right? On the other hand, like I think one could venture that there's a kind of love here too, right? Like even in worship, there's a kind of love of dying here, as much as fear. I'm definitely not discounting that.
Well, you think it would endorse something like amor fati, which is a kind of a love of
fate.
I wouldn't. The way Spinoza often talks about this, I just copied a little bit. That the free man would think of nothing less than death. His wisdom would be a meditation of life. A free man thinks of death least of all things. His wisdom is a meditation not of death but of life. These phrasings is very particular about sort of the way he's making this push into what sad passions are, how they affect us, and what they're doing. Because again, it's very focused around the idea of how someone who just being in fear, or someone who is constantly thinking of death, they will be that influences. That would be the thing that's driving, and it would become a worship. It's not a love. It's not. It's like these are he's very much trying to push us away from this idea of like there's like a good version of these sad things, or that fear does something for us positive. So it's not even really amor fati, knowing that you die. It's that a free man wouldn't consider death. Period. That's the end.
Or perhaps it's
Yeah, I think the point is that this paragraph is about the sad passions. It's not about the positive passions. You know, the joy, passions of joy. So that's what it's about, and so as part of that, there is that, as you say, you know, there is this worship of death, because basically it's we can only think about death and how to keep from dying, and it's kind of driven by fear, which is one of the sad passions.
Yeah, to build off your point, I think that's the thing too, right? Like it's going at how good and evil, blame and merit, sin and redemption, right? These are ways in which life is poisoning itself. Because like to me, the thing that's kind of happening here is in a way, Deleuze is this is contrasted with like virtue ethics, but even like a lot of stuff you see in existentialism in terms of fleeing toward death. And I don't have a larger point on that because it'll take us out of the paragraph. But as far as like good and evil, blame and merit, sin and redemption goes, right? That's a pretty bold thing he's venturing there.
Yeah, it's. I mean, it's his words. I think I've even used before that I've one in the position of someone who has sad passions would fear death rather than desire life. He's splitting the he's putting a difference between the two, that there is uh, really sad passions, how they operate, how they work. As we do not live, we only lead a semblance of life. We can only think of how to keep from dying. Whole life is, again, it's not meant to be like a positive, oh, we worship death, we've understood it, we care about it. We try to keep from dying. It's a fear, it's a sad passion. Let's get to the next, because we'll continue. This doesn't slow down.
So does the sad passions, the fear of death make you hate life? Is that what his point is?
I'm hesitant to say that it's that kind of cause and effect. It's much more that if you experience fear, like if you're in the sad passions, there is a way of looking at ethics, a way of looking at how one say that my worry of what I will feel on my deathbed, or my worry of what death will be, causes me to live a better life. That's, I think, a very rote, boring version of how to look at a lot of religions, but it is a thing that I think even today people sort of talk about. The reward or punishment based on behavior. Rather than that, what that does, that sort of system of sad passions basically keep you in this place of trying to avoid death, avoid to be afraid, to be in these sad passions, create sort of its own loop, rather than someone who is wanting to live, which is an affirming thing. There's a difference. And it's wholly negative. He's trying to get away from the idea that there's a positive version of what he's calling sad passions. Because a lot of people take it as a positive thing. You go, oh, look, at least he's not doing these things. No. He's also trying to get away from rewards and talk about. Not really. But let's continue, because the rest of this does get into this pretty quickly. This critique of sad passions is deeply rooted in the theory of affections. An individual is, first of all, a singular essence, which is to say, degree of power. A characteristic relation corresponds to this, and a certain capacity for being affected corresponds to this power. Furthermore, this relation assumes parts. This capacity for being affected is necessarily filled by affection. Thus, animals are defined less by the abstract notions of genus and species than by a capacity for being affected, by which affections of which they are capable, by the excitations which react with limits of capability. Consideration of a genera and species still implies a morality, whereas the ethics is an ethology, which, with regard to men and animals, in each case only considers their capacity for being affected. Now, from the viewpoint of an ethology, one needs first to distinguish between two sorts of affections: actions, which are explained by the nature of the affected individual, spring from the individual's essence, and passions, which are explained by something else, and which originate outside the individual. Hence, the capacity for being affected is manifested as a power of acting, insofar as it is assumed to be filled by active affection, but as a power being acted upon, insofar as it is by passions. For a given individual, i.e., for a given degree of power assumed to be constant within certain limits, capacity for being affected itself remains constant within those limits, but the power of acting and the power of being acted upon vary greatly, in inverse ratio to 1. Can be a little bit more complex.
Well, he wants to go into the theory of effect from which this notions of the sad passions is derived. So he says this critique of the previous paragraph, this critique of sad passions deeply rooted in theory of affections. And I think we need to go through this really carefully, just to kind of try and pull out what's being said. So first thing, an individual is first of all a singular essence, which is to say a degree of power. So let me take each term in particular. So for example, it is an individual. It's not a kind of, we're not talking about kind of people in general. This is an individual. And because of that, we can say it's a singular essence. So the notion of essence is usually a kind of term of generality, I would say, whereas here it's the opposite of that. So an individual is a singular essence. It's an essence that refers to just that individual person, and which is a degree of power. So what we can say from that sentence is that each individual has a degree of power. So a degree, a level, or however you want to describe it, but a level of power. So that's the first sentence. And he said a characteristic relation corresponds to this essence. So we've started from a singular essence, which corresponds to a characteristic relation. And if you remember from the beginning of this chapter, the notion of relations was one of composition, decomposition, if you remember back to that. And a certain capacity for being affected corresponds to this degree of power. So if we go back, individual is a singular essence and a degree of power. So we kind of split them a little bit. And then that split is continued in the next sentence. The characteristic relation corresponds to its essence. So the singular essence of the individual has a characteristic relation, which uses the same term at the beginning of this chapter to refer to the relations of the capacity of relation. We are made up of parts, but these parts can enter into kind of relationships of composition, decomposition with other bodies. So we need to just keep that in mind, I think. and a certain capacity for being affected corresponds to this degree of power. And I think one of the things, again, we need to kind of understand is that the word capacity is related to the word power. So if we miss that, then we kind of miss what's being said. A certain capacity for being affected corresponds to this degree of power. So each individual um, has a characteristic relation. They also have and they have a capacity for being affected, which corresponds to their degree of power. I mean, it's not incredibly clear at the moment, but it's sort of laying down the foundations, I would say. And he goes on, furthermore, this relation subsumes parts, this capacity of being affected is necessarily filled by affection. So he said what they're kind of, each is split into, is kind of broken up. This relation subsumes parts, which is something he's already said, this capacity of being affected is necessarily filled by affection. So that's this power of being affected is filled by affections. And that leads to him to be able to that leads him to be able to say animals are defined less by the abstract notions of genus and species than by the capacity of it being affected. So again, we've got this word capacity, and we're going to see capacity work through three different forms of capacity. The animals are defined less by abstract notions of genus. So genus and species, you know, what things are in general, the general, and it goes down to the kind of particular. So it starts from the general to the particular genus, species. Rather, he said they're defined by capacity for being, so their power for being affected by the affections of which they are capable. So the capable is the power, the capable, and by the excitations to which they react within the limits of their capacity.
Capability.
So we have three kind of.
But it's capacity.
Sorry, limits of capability.
Right,
Yeah. So we have three forms of power within that defines animals, and animals, yeah, and perhaps ourselves as well. But it's kind of related here to animals.
Yeah, well,
And,
it's the way that he sort of sets it up is, because it's worth before moving on because it's going to get really a lot right here. Is instead of thinking of any of us as sort of a predefined thing, like an animal, for example, talk about where someone is on the tree of life, and we put you're in this genus, this animal's in this. That's where they go. Like no, instead let's sort of dismiss this sort of transcendental, like these transcendent categories, and let's talk instead and look at this each creature as being its own. Think of it as a singularity of power, and that goes up or down various ways. And the way that that is affected is it's affected by its relations with other power. Like these things affect each other. So animals, less defined by, oh, you're this kind of dog because that's where you go. And it's actually, no, it's our relations with them. Really what makes an animal is first their capacity for being affected, the affections of which they then are also capable, and the excitations to which they react. So it's basically this, again, node in this series of relations, power, disempowered, uh, affected in general by other nodes sort of surrounding it, basically giving a contingency to the existence versus a transcendent. A dog is this genus, this species, this family as a thing. Because again, he's trying to move away from the morality, which if we go back a little bit, it's been morality very about these transcendent.
yeah, and I think one of the major implications of this is that, but rather than being one being defined as part of a large group, you are defined as you are in yourself. So it goes from the, it goes from the generic to the individual. This is why he says an individual. This is why he starts off this paragraph effectively by talking about the individual. So we're now becoming, in Spinoza's philosophy, rather than being this kind of common, this mass, which, humankind, or whatever you want to say, we are individuals that have power for acting in certain ways.
Mhm.
And will respond in certain ways. Each will respond differently. And I think that's one of the key things. We're not all we're not all the same. We have got individuality, and I think that but the individuality comes from this ethics, or as he describes it, this ethology, which is basically a kind of a way of acting, a way in which we act.
Well, it's actually slightly, I would say it's slightly different, because the phrase he uses is the only thing that the ethics considers is the capacity for being affected. It's not so much the response or what the response, because that's sort of the after effect, but instead it's the capacity for being affected specifically.
Yeah, but the affects, as we say, there are two types of affects: there's passions and there's actions.
Yes.
So I think that's the next part of this.
To play off that point too, I think it's important to see what constitutes an individual, right? Because there's discussion of animals, there's discussion of man here in ethology. As I'm taking it, right, and I'm just jumping ahead real quick, but that last sentence.
Is it?
So in the second half of this paragraph, so he says, so we've got to talk about affections. So from a viewpoint of ethology of man, one needs to first distinguish. So he goes away from animals, now he's focusing on humanity, on man, as he says. Now, from the viewpoint of ethology of man, one needs first to distinguish between two sorts. So there are two sorts of affections. There's actions, which are explained by the nature of the affected individuals, and which spring from the individual's essence and passions. So this singular essence explains the actions that we're capable of, I would say. But there are passions which are explained by something else, which originate outside the individual. So the actions are from within, and the passions are from without. I think that's a kind of crucial idea. And he said, hence the capacity for being affected is manifested as a power of acting, insofar as it is assumed to be filled by active affections, but as a power of being acted upon, as it is filled by passion. So you get these two things in concert, I would say. For a given individual, for a given degree, so it's individual again, we're coming back to the individual, which has a given degree of power, so that's individual to them, assumed to be constant within certain limits. Again, the notion of constant as a relationship to power, I would say, and within limits, it has certain limits. The capacity for being affected itself remains constant within these limits. But the power of acting and the power of being acted upon vary greatly in inverse ratio to each other. So the power of one's ability to act and the power of being acted upon vary greatly in inverse relation, in inverse ratio. So if we're a power of acting to be able to do something increases as the actions of the passions acting upon us. So that passions come from outside and they act upon us, but they have this inverse ratio. So our kind of our ability or our capability of acting increases the less we are kind of acted upon.
Yeah, and actions specifically is worth taking. Just the lines that one of the things I'd focus on, because he doesn't spend a lot of time defining actions. It's very tight, but it's very specific. The way he ends it by saying, which spring from the individual's essence. Actions aren't. I have a suite of actions in front of me, post being affected by passions, and I'm choosing from them. It is less that. It is that the nature of the affected individual and the action springs from the essence. The way that Spinoza talks about sort of the opportunities here is about an individual understanding themselves and the world more, leads to them acting more from their own necessity rather than from the sort of slavery aspect. Bad passions. So actions aren't I've I'm having myself affected upon, and then I'm making choices, and then not quite.
Yeah, one of the action and the essence, that actions derive from, and the passions. Do they correspond? Those two things correspond to the what Spinoza understand as the mind and body, that they are parallel, um, you know, uh, parallel processes.
I wouldn't
Oh,
necessarily say parallel, but I'd be hesitant to say that they're like. I think they use. I'll let someone else answer.
yeah, they're parallel, but I don't think Deleuze has really gone through how this pertains to that yet. Maybe we could say a degree of power is a way of talking about body and mind, but it's probably a little early to make that move. Um, but what? Oh, go ahead, JK.
Yeah, because when he mentions that the passions are, from the outside, and the actions are associated with the essence, which is derived from the inside. And so I was thinking that they may correspond or correlate with the mind and the body as he understands them. How they derive from ultimately they derive from the same substance or God or nature, the infinite substance. But in the individual, they operate kind of like um, in concert, but possibly in parallel. Or anyway, there's a distinction between them, but ultimately there isn't, right?
Well, there's a parallelism, right? I, I've got something to say. I'll let Derek respond to that first, though. Go ahead, Derek.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to remember that. So, what he says about the individual is that the individual is a degree of power. So that is what he's saying. And he says, so from the viewpoint, one needs to first distinguish between two sorts of actions which are explained by the nature of the affected individual and which spring from the individual's essence. The essence of the individual is that they're a degree of power. So that means a kind of sort of value of a power value. I think the next paragraph hopefully will kind of develop that further. But the kind of notion of parallelism is, if we go back, that was in, I think, the first of these practical theses. And that is about the parallel between the mind and the body. It's not really, well, we could see, I think there is, what he's talking about here are passions and actions and passions. And I think essentially is focusing on the body, so that I think, it doesn't make that incredibly clear, but I think for me, that's the implication of this. But it doesn't really matter because with the theory of parallelism, what happens in the body is or paralleled in the mind and vice versa. So this is the whole point of his method, or one of the points I should say, is that by defining how the body works, you will find how the mind works, and in particular, it's the body that we don't know. So we lack knowledge about the body, but also it's the mind as the unconscious mind. Remember, we had this last week, I think it was, we talked about the conscious and the unconscious, and it is the unconscious. So it's the unconscious in parallel to the unknown body. And I think what's happening here is a theory of affection, as he calls it, the theory of affections, and how affections work on us in terms of allowing us to act in certain ways, but they also depress, or they can elevate us, they can make us sad, or they can make us joyful. One of which stops us from acting, and the other one which enables us to act. And I think that is the kind of point. I mean, they are separated into two kind of parts, so, actions and passions.
Yeah, because I think for me, I think the degree of power is probably the most telling thing, right? So, like to your point on the value, but if you were to think of like a measuring stick or a ruler, right? Not so much a tyrant, but a ruler in the sense of like a yardstick, right? There are degrees on it, or units, right? It's a way of kind of measuring something, um, or like a thermometer does this, right?
Intensities and thermometer would.
Sure, we can talk about heat there too, right? But the trick is it's one unit, right? It's 1 degree of power, which for me, I suspect that's going to be like a body and a mind, or a group of bodies and a group of minds. But we'll let Deleuze define that when he gets around to defining it. The thing I wanted to say about that, though, so in that sense, right, like the internal, the external bit, to me, that's like saying within that unit, right, is that of action. So the capacity um, of the unit is its action, which is an interesting way to think of action, right? Because in that sense, it's very potential. At the same time, the um, the passions, right, are a question of what can affect that unit. So that unit's affectability, right, or it's in a sense, it's kind of what can be done to it as a unit, so to speak, seems to be what defines its passions, right? And so if you put those two things together, I think at this point, what Deleuze is illustrating is like, in that sense, the composition gives you um, your action, right? It gives you the composition of a degree of power, and it also gives you what can be done to that power in a manner of speaking, right, as a passion. And as far as decomposition goes, right, that gives you a way of talking about how the degree of power can be changed in terms of its actions, or it can be changed in terms of its passions, right? I think decomposition is the closest thing we're getting to kind of like an imminent death here. But
Yeah,
that's what I had there.
I think
But let me finish my point right quick. Because that relationship is what subsumes the parts, right? And that's kind of the thing about the individual here, is that it has its parts subsumed by this relationship. Go ahead.
yeah, I think the point of the theory of affections in this paragraph is, well, how does the tyrant keep the slave under control? What you know, basically what's being said is that the slave, the tyrant utilizes the power of passions and the power to kind of keep the slave mystified, and so, and I think underneath that we could say stops them from acting. And I think this paragraph is the theory of affections that allows that to happen. You know, if so, we're talking about actions, what the individual can do, passions which come from outside, which can either encourage action or activity or discourage. So obviously what the tyrant wants to do is not to encourage actions on the behalf of the slaves, the one that the tyrant wants to keep under control. So this is the theory of affections that allows this, that from that you can see, you know, you can see how that might work. But then obviously from out of that comes its opposite as well, the kind of joyful passions as well.
We could also add on to that, right? A manner of speaking of tyranny here is, so again, like working from composition, decomposition, right? It's a way of taking the sad passions in terms of like, right? So something outside of 1 degree of power, affecting that degree of power to extend its capacities in a sense, right? Because the other thing that stuck out to me was the inverse relationship, where it's almost like, and I almost wonder if the sad passions kind of toy with that. But anyways, that being said, right, the sad passion would here seem to be a way of extending action in a manner of speaking, right? But there would appear to be something kind of dubious about that, right? Because that's working through something transcendent.
That's much more how I read it. But I do want to keep pushing through. He does explain a good number of these things. Paragraph. It is necessary to distinguish not only between actions and passions, but also between two sorts. The nature of the passions, in any case, is to fill our capacity for being affected, while separating us from our power of acting, keeping us separated. But when we encounter an external body that does not agree with our own, whose relation does not enter into composition with ours, it is as if the power of that body opposed our power, bringing about a subtraction or a fixation. When this occurs, it may be said that our power of acting is diminished, blocked, that the corresponding passions are those of sadness. In the contrary case, when we encounter a body that agrees with our nature, one whose relation compounds with ours, we may say that its power is added to ours. The passions that affect us are those of joy, and our power of acting is increased or enhanced. Joy is still passions, has an external cause, still remain separated from our power of acting, possessing it only in a formal sense. Power of acting is increased. We approach the point of conversion, the point of transmutation that will establish our dominion, that will make us worthy of action, active joys. The separation of the two here, finally getting to what sort of is seen as sad passion, or how Spinoza defines it, I think is important to sort of, we're discussing all these different things, because again, we're going to the idea of bodies, but specifically, and it's really the interesting line here, an external body, positive, constructive, it's the effect of joy. The joy is still passion. It's still external bodies interacting with ours. Again, this goes back to, I think, both of the previous two things he was talking about Spinoza, about how we come to the moralizing of what is a good or bad body, or good or bad relation, good or evil relation, and shifting what that means when these things have this. Use a restroom, please.
Yeah, so he, in this paragraph, he distinguishes between the two sorts of passions. So we have passions and actions. Here now we distinguish between two sorts of passions, which are the sad passions and the joyful passions. And these are the nature of the passions, in any case, to fill our capacity for being affected, while separating us from our power of acting. And what's interesting is that this is true for both states of passion, i.e. the joyful and the sad states of passion. So that they separate us from our power of acting, keep us separated from that power. But when we encounter an external body that does not agree with our own, whose relation does not enter into composition with ours, it is as if the power of that body opposed our power, bringing about a subtraction or a fixation. So when this occurs, it may be said that our power of acting is diminished. So when we meet something that doesn't, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know. The opposite of elevates, it depresses us. Say depresses in some way. And say you could say that an individual, and he gives an example of food. He gives examples of, let's say, an individual that we may meet. But anyway, when we encounter, these are all external bodies that does not agree with ours, so that they don't elevate us. They so I mean the example I think he gives is food, like something poison, a poison. It is as if the power of that body opposed our power, bringing about a subtraction or a fixation. But when this occurs, so the power, there's a reduction in power, and the power that's reduced actually is the power of acting is diminished or blocked, and the corresponding passions over sadness. So I think what we have is, again, it's this separate. They are separate, so you can't kind of say they're the same thing. One leads to the other, and but he said that in the passions, so there's two types. So in both of them separate us from the power of acting. And it seems clear, I mean, the kind of sad passions, the kind of thing when we meet a body that doesn't agree with ours, will, by necessity, would lead to this, our power of acting being diminished. That seems kind of completely logical. But in the contrary case, when we encounter a body that agrees with our nature, one whose relation compounds. So the first one decomposes, the second one compounds with ours. And we say that its power is added to ours, and the powers that affect us. So the passions that correspond to that, the passions that we have, are those of joy, and our power of acting is increased or enhanced. No, it says this joy is still a passion, and which, as we said before, is an external cause. So we remain separated from our power of acting, possessing it only in a formal sense. So I think this bit at the end is kind of, I find, kind of complex. So we are separated from our power of acting. I mean, that is the kind of fact. But so anyway, joy is still a passion. So it has an external cause. Sorry, let me just go back. Passions are external. Actions are internal. So joy is still a passion since it has an external cause. We still remain separate from our, but we remain separate from our power of acting, possessing only. I'm not sure what it means by the formal sense, but perhaps we could come back to this. But he said this power of acting is nevertheless increased proportionally. We approach the point of conversion. So there is this this point of conversion, this point of change, or well, he calls it transmutation, and establish our dominion that will make us worthy of action, of active joys. So we have to. It changes us. It seems to change us in ourselves, so that we become worthy of these active joys. So it's really, I think it's a really interesting, kind of unexpected idea within this, I would say.
So you could say that one's power of acting really is contingent on the passions that are affecting us, right? Whether it's sadness or joy, and joy enhances our capacity for action. So it's a relationship between the tyrant and the subject. Tyrant and the is one between the tyrant and the slave, or the tyrant and the free person who's not affected by the tyrant's influence.
Yeah, I would say at this point we should forget the tyrant-slave structure, because he's talking. What the point about the tyrant and slave is that the tyrant can utilize this affection, this structure of affection that we're all subject to in terms of actions and passions, so they can utilize it for their own ends. So what these paragraphs that we're in at the moment are about are not about that relationship. They're about how we are affected. We're actually made subject to sad passions, or we're subject to joyful passions. But also in relation to that, our power of acting, our power to act. So the point is that when our power of acting is diminished, we are subject. Well, when we meet a body that doesn't agree with ours, that enters into a relationship of decomposition, then our power of acting is diminished. So so you could, if you want to extrapolate that out into a tyrant, which is not. This is not about a tyrant, but if you want to extrapolate that, a tyrant might then make you feel there's something going on that you should be very worried about. So that will depress your power of acting. It will make you more and more malleable. Whereas the opposite of that is obviously when we meet something that elevates us. So something that will enter into a relationship of composition. So the first one is decomposition. It decomposes our relation. We are made up of parts which are in a composite relationship. We meet another body which itself is made up of part which enters into our relationship with our parts, and the thing that results in the first one is decomposition. The second one is when they're added to ours, and which elevates. And these are the passions of joy, and which increases our power of acting, is increased or enhanced. And he said this joy is still a passion, which has an external cause, But the point is at the end, like not the point, but the interesting, the way in which this paragraph ends. He says the power of acting is nonetheless increased proportionally, even though we're separated from this power, because it comes from outside. We approach the point of conversion, the point of transmutation that will establish our dominion, that will make us worthy of action. So, in other words, perhaps, I don't know, but perhaps the notion of our dominion means that we are sovereign to ourselves rather than subject to a tyrant. We are sovereign to ourselves, and it makes us worthy. And in that way, because we understand how to act, understand, we affirm life and these and the accompanying joyful passions, they will make us worthy of actions. We become worthy of actions and become worthy of active joys. These are joys. So, and in fact, if you look at that term, active joys, what we've got in that two-word term, we've got together the action and the passions are joined in one thing.
Yeah,
the end of the
he's talking
previous,
about, yeah.
really quick, the end of the previous paragraph, though, because it's here we're talking about for the power of acting and passions, but the previous paragraph did end with the power of acting and the power of being acted upon vary greatly in another. So when acted upon in intense, heavy ways, my power of acting is diminished, and vice versa. The less I'm acted upon, the more that I have power of acting. So there's the capacity for being affected remains constant within the given power itself. So whatever variable the individual is, like whatever element, that is sort of just say 100% of whatever's happening, that singular essence, degree of power. Within that, the power for that to act is dependent on how much acted upon. Uh, this setup sort of creates that inverse ratio. And then for this, the power of acting itself is increased proportionally. We approach the point of conversion, the point of transmutation that will establish our dominion, that makes us worthy of action, of joys. This joy of passion still has an external cause. External causes are greatly impacting what we're able to do.
We could go back to JK's question for a minute, though. Like, the one thing I wanted to say there is, I think it's important, though, not to try and put this in terms of, like, the tyrant is what he is because of his relationship to the slave, by which the slave is what he is because he's underneath the tyrant, right? If you look at how, like, Deleuze is doing this, the slave is constituted by sad passions. The tyrant is constituted by using sad passions to establish his power, to establish himself as a unit in the language of the paragraph we're in, right? So, like, I think that's really important to keep in mind as you go, because in this sense, like, what's getting laid out in this paragraph is how one becomes a slave, how one becomes a tyrant, how one becomes a priest, right? It's not by it's not necessarily by having like a tyrant come down upon you. It's more like how Nietzsche talks about slave morality, right? So one of the examples there is, right, somebody else is doing things, and that affects you by resenting them because they're doing things you would otherwise want to do, right? And if you use that feeling, so to speak, to enhance your own power, you're acting as a tyrant in the sense of this paragraph, in the sense of this section.
Yeah, it's the line from uh, Ethics 3 that I like for this one, I think match. We will see the difference between a man who is led solely by emotions or opinion and a man who is led by reason. The former, whether will or not, performs action, whereof he is ignorant. The latter is his own master and only performs such actions he knows are of primary importance in life and therefore desires. Wherefore I call the former a slave and the latter a free man, concerning whose disposition and manner of life it will be well to make a few observations.
So the primordial passions is one of joy. Is that what he's saying? And that, you know, it could be Yeah, but that's not necessarily the case. Is that does joy change to the sadness on its own, or is it due to influence or from the outside, or is it just a matter of you know um, inherent in the nature of things?
Yeah, if I could there. So it's like composition and decomposition, right? And that is composing or decomposing a unit of power, right? In that sense, so the passions and the actions have a very important relationship, right? And that's that they have an inverse relationship, and that this inverse relationship constitutes um, the power of being acted upon for the individual, right? So if your actions increase, right, unit of power's nature enhances, then its passions decrease, right, and vice versa. So like as we're going through this paragraph here, right, in terms of decomposition, one way to understand that it's being given, right, is that it brings sadness, right, and that decreases the actions. So the proportionality is changing and it's decreasing, right? Um, in the opposite sense, joy is being given as even though it's a passion and external to the individual, right? It's coming with an elevation of the ratio. So the composition is compounding, the ratio is increasing. It's like a really
Yeah, I
mathematic
think the
way of talking about it, but that's what I think is being said.
Yeah, I think something slightly different. So if we go at the beginning of this paragraph, so he says the nature of the passion. So he's talking about the passions now, and he said there are two sorts of passions. In any case, is to fill our capacity of being affected while separated from our power of acting. So we've got we've got this double thing here. One is that our capacity for being affected is filled, and we're separated from our power of acting. So these two things are still there, and they keep us separated from that power. And I think that the point when we encounter an external body, so one that doesn't agree with our own, so in which we enter into this condition of decomposition, it brings about a sad passion, which detracts from our power to act. So again, these two must be kept separate. That they are separate. So one leads to another. I think that's probably the easiest way of saying. But it says, on the contrary, when we encounter a body that agrees with ours, in other words, when we as ourselves and that body enter into a relationship of composition, one whose relation compounds with ours, we may say that its power is added to us. So our power increases, the passion that affects us, and these passions are those of joy. The previous one's one of sadness, that power is increased or enhanced. But he said this joy is still a passion since it has an external cause. So we still remain separated from our power of acting. So the first one, it decreases, but we're still not, we're separated, but it's decreased. But here we're still separated, but it's increased. Our power of acting increased. And the point, I think the end bit is the interesting bit, because so that is a kind of generality we can say for both. But this power of acting is nonetheless increased proportionally. We approach the point of conversion. So this point of conversion, this point of transmutation, that will establish our dominion. So this is how we are changed, I would say, that will make us worthy. We are changed by this. We become worthy of action. And again, like I said before, the active joys. So suddenly the actions and the passions, the actions and the passions from outside become joined together. I think that's how I would read it. Perhaps I might be overdoing it with that, to be honest with you. But it seems to me significant that he would use that phrase, active joys, which is definitely bringing the actions and the passions together in a single, in a two-word phrase.
Yeah, and it goes back to the previous paragraph, right? Hence, the capacity for being affected is manifested as a power of acting, and so far it is assumed to be filled by active affectations. but as a power of being acted upon, insofar as it is filled by passions, right? Because he's establishing the relationship as the two, so that he can close on the power of acting and the power of being acted upon very greatly in inverse ratio to one another, right? So you have one increasing, the other decreasing.
Yeah, but I think, like I say, the point of this paragraph is I don't think it's so much that, it's that they both separate us from power of acting. So they're both, so nature of the passions, in any case, to fill our capacity of benefit, while separates from our power of acting, keep us separated from that power. That is the point for both of these. They're both similar in that. But the kind of second one, through the second one, the kind of the elevation of joy, and which increases our power of acting, our active powers, allows us to approach the point of conversion. A point, and I think this is perhaps where this notion of the two coming together, perhaps is what this is about. The point of transmutation, establish our dominion, or make us worthy of action, of acting.
So the way I understand it is that the kind of passions you have that are based on the what is affecting you from the external world. The sad passions, if that's the case in the world that you're in, would diminish your power for acting, and whereas the other one, the one that enhances your power acting, is one of joy, and that's also dependent on the conditions, right, in the world.
Yeah, it's always a body. It always comes from a body. The passions always come from outside, where the actions are inside. And the point, though, is at the end, this can lead to what he calls a transmutation. A kind of a change, which, in terms of a kind of change of level, this notion of transition, which is we talked about previously. And so I think that this is, it kind of lead all the sad passions and the kind of the denial of the lowering of our power to act. All that leads to is, it doesn't lead anywhere. It doesn't lead to any kind of, well, it leads in the end to a kind of it can, this kind of final point, if it taken to its logical conclusion, can be death. It can be a kind of end of our existence. But the other one leads to a complete kind of joyful affirmation of the world. I think this is something that Deleuze talks about a lot, particularly in terms of Nietzsche, and I think we see this happening here.
So when you say the first one, the sad passions leads to enslavement of sorts, and the second one
No,
leads
I think,
to
like
freedom.
I say, it doesn't lead anywhere, because the point, like I said, I think we need to forget for a moment the tyrant-slave relationship. I mean, it's there, because the tyrant is the one who understands that we are subject to these passions. It doesn't lead, I mean, we don't become, we need to be, if we don't understand the world and how things happen, then we're subject to confusion. I think that's a term that Spinoza uses. And the tyrant, the one who seeks personal advantage, can use those to their own advantage. But it's not intrinsic to the passions that they would lead to that. It's just that we are subject to that. The tyrant is a person who can utilize that condition of those conditions of passions to their own advantage. I think that's the point. It doesn't lead of its own volition to that. It's someone needs to do that to us, and we need to then accept it, because we're so we're confused. Again, these are terms from Spinoza. We're confused about the world and the way things are. That it allows us to kind of feel safe and secure, and carry on, and doing what we're told, basically.
But it is a limitation on one's actions, right? A limitation on one's capacity to act.
It reduces one's capacity to act with sad. But again, to say, this joy is still a passion as an external cause. We still remain separated from our power of acting, possessing it only in a form sense. This power of acting is nonetheless increased proportionally. Approach the point that will establish our dominion, that will make us worthy of the act. Again, to think of it as intensities and thermometer, it's the world and things act upon the thermometer to raise or lower temperature. Not a fine science often, it's just it happens and the thermometer gets more intense. Its capacity to act is incredibly zero. It's a fucking measurement device. Acting is elsewhere. So the intensities that are sort of captured in that singular S, this degree of power that is sort of, this is the capacity for being affected that corresponds to that degree of power. Then this ultimately not that this is where the transmutation happens. Again, it's he uses the term concatenate earlier, and I think that's probably the better phrase it. That we have the sad passions upon us, and these are concatenated into other actions or other justifications or things. Pity, as an example, or whatever it may be. But these are more the effective actions that are then taken. That this is transition. And again, I agree with Derek. I think the idea of the tyrant or the slave is really starting at these global ideas, and instead they were meant to be sort of examples. And how Spinoza talks about really all of us, that there is no, he doesn't, he will critique those in his political stance. This is much more trying to get at us to be able to grasp.
Yeah, to build on that, for me, it's consistent, right? Like the idea in this paragraph is so the triangle is defined through sad passions. Now he's explaining how sad passions come about versus how we might say happy passions come about.
Yeah.
But yeah, just trying to interpret what he means by the bodies that that we are associated with. Determine what kind of passions that we will
All the
experience.
bodies. It's
Right,
all the bodies. It's again, it's the separation outside of morality. If we go back a little bit, it's as much as these are probably simple, stupid things, but it's like the keyboard, the chair that you're in, the person that, like the words said to you, like bodies is, we will be getting to that. Don't worry. It's, again, this is practical philosophy. We're speaking highly, but bodies that match bodies and either are good or bad. They either decompose or strengthen, procompose. Yes, it's, they add
Compound.
to, they compound
Yeah.
or decompose. Yeah. Thank you. And these are kind of the good or bad things. It's a lot of stuff. Smoking a cigarette, it's having a drink, it's reading a book, like bodies as things. And I'm very much oversimplifying. The bodies as things is all that stuff. And again, the singularity, this single point, this individual that you are, is this degree of power that's being affected by this, sad or joy or whatever. Like, and then the capacity for you to then act is affected by these things as well, depending on how much you're being acted. How, and that's what he's getting at here. And then the next bit, unless someone has the last thing to say, the next paragraph I think gets at this, because it's paragraph.
Yeah, just one real quick thing for me.
Please.
So yeah, again, like the individual is it's a degree of power, right? Um, so the degree of power, like I think what's really interesting to me here is this point about being as a power being acted upon insofar as it is filled by passions and so forth. Like it's really interesting in both these paragraphs. Deleuze ends on ratio or proportionality, right? So like a change in one comes with a change in the other, right? And like this is interesting to me because I made the point that this is like contrastable with virtue ethics, which traditionally works with a mean, right? You meet in the middle. Deleuze is doing something different by working with proportionality, but a way in which there's almost like it's like an inverse relationship to me. But just to bring that to a point so we can move on, I thought what was interesting about that is in the previous paragraph, Deleuze ends with saying, The capacity for being affected itself remains constant within those limits, but the power of acting and the power of being acted upon vary greatly in inverse ratio to one another. And then in the paragraph we just read, the power of acting is nonetheless increased proportionally, right? So it's a ratio. We so-called approach the point of conversion, the point of transmutation that will establish our dominion, that will make us worthy of action, of active joys. You might say you reach the point where it materializes, for instance. But it's interesting to me that in both paragraphs, he's ending on this point about the relationship between the two as a proportionality, and one that either increases or decreases, it seems here, or reaches a point of transmutation, right? So it becomes something different.
To the next paragraph. It is this theory of the affection as a whole that defines the status of passion. Whatever their justification, they represent the lowest degree of our. They are most separated from our power of acting when they are most alienated, delivered over to the phantoms of superstition, the mystifications, tyrant. The ethics is necessarily an ethics of joy. Only joy is worth. Joy remains, bringing us near to action, bliss of action. Sad passions always to impotence. This will be the threefold practical problem of the ethics. How does one arrive at a maximum of full passion? Proceeding from there to free and active feelings, although condemn us to bad encounters, sadnesses. How does one manage to form adequate ideas for precisely the source of active feelings, although our natural condition seems to condemn us to have only inadequate ideas of our body or mind? How does one become conscious of oneself, of God, and of things? Quid Dei e rerum alterna quadam necessitate conscius. Or our consciousness seems. Oh, why they wouldn't. Just as an example of a sad passion, because I think it's my favorite example that Spinoza gives direct, is pity. Pity is one of the ones he outlined very, very carefully, because it's the idea of you walking down the street, homeless person who's severely disabled, very hurt. Pity them. It's, on one hand, we like to think of pity as being like an elevated good thing. I pity, I show concern, I have concern. But this feeling doesn't come from that. It comes from impotence to do anything about it. That's the line that Deleuze uses here. There is an impotence to these elements. And the impotence is the thing that begins this process, the sad passions, impotence, inability to do anything about it. We wouldn't be sad if we could, oh, hey, you need $25. Here's $25. There you go. You don't pity anymore, but can't do that. You have the inability. This is the shift. So you have pity, which you feel like it might be a good idea. It's a good emotion, but impotence is the. I'll leave it open.
Yeah, so towards the end of this chapter, he brings the two. So as we were saying before, the theory of affections wasn't really directed at the tyrant-slave kind of dialogue that he entered into, or dialectic, shall we say, or not even, anyway, whatever it is, that we talked about earlier. But these now are brought back together. He says this theory of the affections as a whole, it defines the status of the sad passions. Whatever their justification, they represent the lowest degree of our power. The moment when we're most separated from our power of acting, when we're most alienated, delivered over to the phantoms of superstition, to the mystifications of the tyrant. So yes, what we were saying earlier, that the sad passions enable and deliver us over to the mystifications of the tyrant. And he says the ethics is necessary, an ethics of joy. Only joy is worthwhile. Joy remains, bring us near to action. So this is the point of the ethics: is that it's action. It's something that enables us to act. And again, it's like this. If we think about, he says, so the ethics is a philosophy. He said it is a philosophy of life. So the philosophy of life. Well, how should we act? The necessary ethics for joy. Only joy is worthwhile. Brings us near to action, and to the bliss of action. The bliss of action. So the sad passions always amount to impetus, so i.e. lack of power. And this will be the threefold practical problem on the. So these are the practical problems of the ethics. So the first one: how does one arrive at a maximum of joyful passions, proceeding from there to free and active feelings? So how do we arrive at joyful passions from where we can go to free and active feelings, which is, I think, is that notion of transmutation. I think. Yeah. Although our place in nature seems to condemn us to bad encounters and sadnesses. So it seems, again, how do we escape, the effects of our place in nature, which seems to condemn us to bad encounters, these encounters that decompose us.
And again, the word seems.
Sadness, the sad passions. And the second
the word seems in
problem,
there. The word seems is kind of the big. He uses it a few times. There's a reason for it. The word seems.
Yeah, because he said it's an illusion. I mean, that's what he said. So, and then the second one, the second of these practical problems, how does one manage to form adequate ideas? So the adequate notion of ideas, obviously in the realm of consciousness or the unconscious, they're in the realm of the mind, which are precisely the source of active. So the ideas are the source of active feelings. So again, we've got these active joys, active feelings. This is the point at the end of the previous paragraph. We've got this bringing together these two terms. And how do we manage to form adequate ideas? And he says, although a natural condition seems to condemn us to have only inadequate ideas of our body, of our mind, and of other things. Again, that's something he's already gone through. He said we suffer from confused ideas. We don't know. We only know effects. We have no idea of causes. And it's that notion of the consciousness being that which kind of which guides everything that we do. Consciousness, yeah. How does one become conscious of oneself, of God, and of things? So that Latin phrase, although our consciousness seems inseparable from illusion, so our consciousness is inseparable, or is what he said, it seems inseparable from illusions.
Yeah. I think it's a tight paragraph that's really just driving towards the idea that the ethics is pushing towards something. It's not just a sort of highfalutin, well, here's what's good and bad. It's like, no, how does one find his way to basically freedom? It's a liberating text at its core. Is how does one actually arrive at the maximum of joyful passions so they can have active feel, so they can move to free and active feeling? How does one manage to form adequate ideas, which are the source of active feelings? And how does one become conscious of oneself, which is the thing? It is the big deal. This sort of self mastery or whatever is those three. Goes to the next paragraph. Any questions or notes on this? I'll try to get the next paragraph in. It's short. Then we can do chapter 3 next week.
Yeah, that'd be real quick.
Please.
I just thought what was kind of cool about this paragraph. So like we're getting a different sense of like the subtraction addition thing. What I thought was interesting is that as there's a distance between the passions and the acting, if I understand this correctly, then we're talking about, in some sense, decomposition, but also like this point about the sad passions and that, right? There's something being said about creating a distance between the two. It's interesting to see that when there's an intimacy between the two, right? That's when you start to get at this. So like if it was chemistry, I would say it's like a melting point, right? It's the point at which something changes to to become melting.
The
You're right
point
to
of
say it's like almost
transmutation,
become.
you might say. Transmutation.
Yeah, no, it's exactly transmutation, melting point. Like it's a point of complete change, right? An inflection point if you want to go into calculus. But I just think it's interesting that there's a sense of like intimacy there, right? So you have one in which they're moving away from each other. You have one in which they're kind of like coming together, which it's interesting. It's a little bit different than the inverse that he suggested earlier, but I, I'll leave it there so we can move on to the paragraph.
Excellent. The last paragraph, I am going to pre-state what it is so that way I don't have to read it a second time. Like, it's not a paragraph, I think, that really you go through and we'll pick apart. I'm sure will end up, but it is meant to be read and sort of taken in directly before we move to chapter 3. It's meant to sort of subsume all of this because we've been asking questions about defining this and doing this thing and all this. And Deleuze has a very specific line about this for ethics, which I love. And I think it also applies to the great theories of the ethics, the oneness of substance, the univocity of the attributes, immanence, universal necessity, parallelism, etc., cannot be treated apart from the three practical theses concerning consciousness, values, and the sad passions. The Ethics is a book written twice simultaneously, once in the tenuous stream of definitions, propositions, demonstrations, and corollaries, which develop the great speculative themes with all the rigors of the mind. Another time in the broken chain of scholia, a discontinuous volcanic line, a second version underneath the expressing all the angers of the heart and setting forth practical theses of denunciation and liberation. The entire Ethics is a voyage in immanence, but immanence is the unconscious itself and the conquest. Ethical joy, the correlate of speculative affirmation. I like that last line a lot, just saying I really like that last line. Obviously this book wasn't written twice, but like he's being a little poetic with how he talks about it, and I love when he does this stuff. It's, as we go through, it is important to remember that the book is being written to sort of be this in practice itself. What we're talking about here, this through the last bits that we have kind of these two sides, the sort of speculative elements, the effective response, the immanent and the sort of, you could say, intellectual almost, or the way we've sort of thought about it. The thing that happens in this book, as you is ultimately to remember that it is still, no matter what, and there is an extraordinary amount in the Ethics. If you haven't seen the whole thing, it's a brick of a book, to say the least. And it is written in a really fascinating way where it's like, here's statement 1, and here are the definitions of the words, and here is various ways that you could think of it, and here is various proofs. There are postulates, and it's like, holy fucking, like, it's amazing. It's written like the opposite of poetry. If there is an opposite to poetry, almost, like, it is very specific and harsh and broken up. There's not a lot of paragraphs as we know them. Instead, there are notes underneath propositions, underneath lines, and it's all broken up. But it's the way he's done this is to give us this continuous stream of these elements to develop the great speculative themes with all the rigors of the mind, is going to be an ongoing theme as we look. And then also through this, there's this odd broken chain of scholia. The way that it's written is not almost, is almost broken and odd and emergent and immanent. And it's a very strange combination of the two. And that's why Deleuze is saying that the entirety of it is a voyage in immanence, the conquest of the unconscious. It's a very unique journey, and I would agree with this statement. If you haven't seen it, it's really worth, like, just looking at copies. There's a few versions online. Project Gutenberg has it, and it is not a normally written philosophical treatise. At least, I mean, there are others like it, but it's not it's not like a lot of others that I've seen. So it's very unique and built in a very special way that gives it this sort of odd thing, ethical joy. I really like.
Yeah, I think the books were written like a work of geometry. I think
It really is.
That's his
It is like a math book. It is
So,
like a math book. I like that.
But there's, you can see things similar to that, like Wittgenstein's Tractatus has a similar kind of, well, not similar, but it has a particular structure as well, which is to do with short statements. But I think then you can look at someone like Nietzsche, who deals in aphorisms. So I think this is, yeah, as you say, it's a completely different way of working, because it's much more analytical. And perhaps one could think it's the beginning of analytical philosophy, but also the beginnings of continental philosophy. But this is an interesting aspect. Yeah, it's great kind of sudden massive. Yeah. Yes. So yeah, just in this paragraph, so he talks about what he began with, about the theories of the ethics: oneness of substance, univocity of the attributes, immanence, universal necessity, parallelism, which some of which we've touched on, but most of which we haven't. He said it can't be treated from the three practical theses, and that's what we've been going through in the three practical theses in relation to consciousness, or the devaluation of consciousness values, and the sad passions. And then he talks about the ethics is a book written twice. So again, about the form of the book. So it once has this continuous stream of definitions, propositions, demonstrations, and corollaries, which is the kind of geometrical method, which develops a great speculative themes with all the rigors of the mind. Another time, and then underneath that is the broken. So one is a kind of a continuous stream, whereas underneath that there is this broken chain, a discontinuous volcanic line. So it's very different. One is a stream, and one is a volcanic line, a kind of flowing line of whatever volcanic stuff is. A second version underneath. So there's two versions. One underneath, second expressed, and the second one expresses all the anger of the heart, and setting forth the practical thesis of denunciation and liberation. And I think he says in that note at the bottom, number 21, he said this was this thing of having two books in one. He said this was a common procedure that consisted in concealing the boldest or least orthodox arguments in appendices or notes. He said Spinoza renewed the procedure with the systematic method of scholia, which referred to each other and are themselves connected to the prefaces and appendices, thus forming a second subterranean ethics. So one is on the surface and flows. Second one has a very particular way of flowing. It's a discontinuous volcanic line. And then he brings at the end, he brings the two together. He said the entire ethics is a voyage in immanence. So again, it's by immanence, I would understand it's the opposite of the kind of transcendent. So it's kind of something designed to change it. But immanence in the unconscious is the unconscious itself.
Yeah,
this is the kind.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no.
Bayle's dictionary, as an example, I think it helps understand sort of what is happening as you read it. So Bayle's dictionary is famous during the Enlightenment because he, like, it's less a dictionary and it's more Encyclopedia Britannica of the era. And so if you can imagine, and I'm going to just use, because I don't remember any particular examples, but just imagine it's like this, like I'm writing about the same thing, but about the DGQC, and I go, Derek joins our readings, blah, 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 blah. Like I give him a definition. And then at the end, I have like 20 footnotes, but the footnotes are endnotes, are in the back of the book. And they're labyrinthian and Byzantine nightmares of reading. But in there, I write, also, Derek's a piece of shit. Fuck that guy. I hate him. Like, it's that kind of stuff where it's like the worst things were kept, like hard line, really kind of awful shit written about people was kept in the footnotes of everything. I don't think that about you, Derek, by the way. But it's just this, it's just a really fascinating way that they sort of got away with it, because they even understood, what, 500 fucking years ago, that people who read still don't read fucking footnotes. That was where they put the really, really juicy shit, which is kind of hilarious to me in a lot. But that's kind of what Spinoza's doing with this, that a lot of it is sort of written in this way of being able to get away with the church, who didn't really do the secondary text. They didn't really pull up the footnotes. They just kind of read the main thing, and then here's these other stuff in the bottom. And so that's very much how this book is written. So it's written less with footnotes, to me at least, like the footnotes. Maybe this changed in the versions I've got. It would be interesting, sort of the genealogy of the text. But how and I'm going to put it a little bit more poetically, when I read it, and I read it the first time, it felt like it was a bear to start. And I was like, oh, because I was anticipating a lot. But there is a secondary sort of weird thing happening, that intellectually your brain is dancing and making its way through, and it feels like there's something cool going on. I don't know how else to put it. It feels like, okay, this is cool. Okay. So there's this secondary sort of push. And that's, I think what he's saying here is that there's, when we talk about two texts in one, on the one side, it's the text itself and how it's written, but at the same time, it also is written in a particular way that does also bring out these sort of secondary, honestly, joyful effects. Notes and ATP are very similar, but AO as well. But I mean, the dictionary they mention is just, it's a great example, because it's just really good on religious people and famous people and everything. Just awful things they would write at the end. Pretty hilarious. I mean, it's hilarious for like the 1600s. It's not like really clever Eminem cipher stuff you're going to see on YouTube, but I think it's pretty entertaining.
Yeah,
I mean,
and
you can't
yeah.
go
So and that
good, Derek.
I was just going to say the last sentence kind of takes us to the unconscious. So,
Yep.
and it kind of reminds us about the kind of theme at the beginning of this chapter, which is the body. We don't know what the body can do, and the kind of parallel of that is that we don't know the unconscious. We have no understanding of the unconscious. Everything's ruled, it seems, by consciousness. So the kind of the point of these two kind of levels of the ethics is that it says it's a voyage, so a stream and a volcanic line. So there's a notion of flow. The entire is a voyage in immanence, but immanence is the unconscious. So this notion, what's internal to us is the unconscious, the working of the unconscious, rather than being subject to consciousness and the conquest of the unconscious. So it allows us access to it. And he says the ethical joy, then brings us back to ethical joy, is the correlate of speculative affirmation. And I think the notion of speculative, I don't know, I mean, speculative, the way I would think of speculative affirmation, it's the notion, it's the affirmation of what goes beyond us. I mean, the speculative is traditionally the otherworldly, shall we say. So in metaphysics, that was the speculative was the other world, the kind of world that was beyond our consciousness. But ethical joy is saying here is a correlate. It's the thing that goes along with it has a relationship to this speculative affirmation. So it's a kind of term that I imagine it need sort of really unpicking because I don't quite get it, to be honest.
Say that one more time. What part don't you get?
Well, so he says immanence, and then he says speculative. So immanence I take to mean the opposite of transcendent. So it's a kind of internal to the individual. It's the unconscious. Whereas ethical joy is the correlate of speculative. So the question is, what does speculative mean in this case? Like I said, I mean, I think if in the, let's say, the scholastics, the speculative is related to the beyond the world. You know, it's the metaphysical realm is the speculative. The realm of metaphysics is speculative, so it's what enables us to kind of go into that realm. I'm not saying it's the same. I'm just saying that that's would be my understanding of speculative, but I imagine that's not correct. But I don't know. I can't say. You know, that's what I'm saying. It would. I think it ends on this. You know, this slightly mysterious sentence. You know, is a correlate. Ethical joy is a correlate of speculative affirmation.
Yeah, and it's a pretty much a direct translation by French. So it's very much what he wrote in the original, which is nice when we talk about the correlate, and he's kind of talking again about the two sides. We've talked at length about the action and the action. We've talked about the parallelism, correlate these elements. To me, this is how I read it, and I have no idea if it's accurate, but that the speculative affirmation, which is intellectual practice that we're going through, or you go through in reading, for example, ethics, and then ethical joy, which affirming action that is acted upon. That's how I read it, is that these things come together here, and that's what the two sides of the book, how I might be wrong. That's just
I mean, another the notion of speculative. I mean, in philosophy. I mean, in later philosophy, like Kant, for example, is related to the imagination.
Yep.
So
Mental,
the power of
intellectual
imagination is what it allows us to go beyond the real, effectively. So, yeah. So I think there is something in all that sentence says a hell of a lot, you know.
Agree. Agree completely. Yeah, it's the phrasing is interesting. Speculative themes, all the rigors of the phrasing he talks about right before. So I think that's what I've sort of pulled it back to. Oh, so. All right. Well, with that, we're out. It's been our time. We will next week continue with the next chapter, the Letters on Evil, which is writings he had with Blinberg. I'll toss a PDF up. It'll take me a minute to find it. I have a very poorly organized Spinoza dump. Well, that one is not named. It's